Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedictine, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen-Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello. I'm great, man. I had an amazing weekend. I'm so tired, though.
What did you do? Run a marathon again?
No. This time I just hung out with friends on on the water, went paddleboarding and stuff. We had a little cabin getaway with some close friends, which was just amazing for one, because we haven't really got to do something that intimate with other people in, a year and a half, 2 years. So that was great, but it was like one of those weekends where you're chilling so hard that you're exhausted by the, the work week. I don't know. It's like we ate too much, unhealthy food and had way too many beers and sat in the sun for too long. But 10 out of 10 weekend. How about you?
Actually pretty similar. I had we were on Saturday, we were hiking with the kids, which was pretty awesome. It was very, very hot and also exhausting, but it was also very, very cool, perfect day. And yeah, we were hiking, and then we were invited at my mom's place to a barbecue, and I ate until I had physical pain. Really, it was really, really painful, and I just didn't stop. And that's a problem I have in general.
Yeah, me too.
The funny thing is my wife couldn't stop laughing because I wanted to lose some weight the last couple of weeks, and I did actually. I'm not overweight or anything, but I just felt a little uncomfortable, and I started running more. I started eating less, and on Saturday I was close to hitting my goal, and I got on the scale in the morning, and then after we came home from my mom's place, in the evening, and during that day, although we were hiking for 4 hours or 4.5 hours, and I was sweating and burning calories and all that, throughout the day I gained 3 kilos, which is it's 6 pounds, through one day. I don't know how. Yeah. How much can one person eat? That's just impossible. I mean, I drank a lot, I ate a lot, but 6 pounds in one day, what's going on? So it just hurt. I looked like I was pregnant, and yeah, yesterday was then recovery.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, we spent the day in the garden with some friends, and yeah, that's was a awesome weekend as well. So
very good.
Yeah. Other than that, I have thought about something over the weekend, and that is something I want to ask our audience, and that is, I spent some time in some other communities online, and I noticed that, and I've been noticing that for a while actually, that a lot of people with their communities online are moving to Discord and away from Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone does it, but some people do, and some people start out on Discord. And I had a conversation on the weekend with some people that are in completely other. It's a completely different thing. They don't have to do anything with recording, but apparently it's pretty normal, and it's a pretty popular platform to communicate. And I'm not I didn't use it as much, to be honest, but it seemed that a lot of people are using it. So long story short, I had a look at it. I set up an account and I checked it out, and I can see why people like that platform. I'm very late on this because it's been popular for a while. And now I just want to know if that is maybe something that we should do as well. If you, when you're listening to this podcast right now, if you would prefer that, or if we should stay on Facebook with our community. I like the way the community works now on Facebook, but if more people are using Discord than Facebook, then it would make sense to move. So I made this little poll in the Facebook community, and I'm curious to see the results. And if it turns out that most people actually prefer Discord, maybe we move. I don't know.
Yeah.
So let us know. Check out the community. It's the selfrecordingband.com/community. Right now, this link takes you to the Facebook community, and there's this poll. And let us know what you prefer. And if Discord is the winner, maybe we should move.
Yeah, I'd be super curious to hear that. I'm part of a couple Discord servers, and it's pretty cool. I don't know. It's less of a wormhole than Facebook is, so could be cool.
Exactly. I can totally see why people like it. I'm super late to the party, and I haven't joined it until this weekend, but I began to think about it, and let's see.
Yeah, totally.
All right. Then today we talk about, I wanted to say gear, but not really. We talk about, but yeah, part of it is the gear talk, but we talk about very practical things that you can do to your vocal. We talk about our vocal chains. We talk about processing vocals while you're recording, but also in the mix, we talk about our approaches to that, our why, and the thought process behind that. And there is, if you're wondering like what gear to use or which plugins to buy or which, I don't know, there is a gear guide that I have for you that is completely free. If you go to the slef-recordingband.com/gear guide, you can download that, and then we can skip the part of like which microphone you should buy and stuff in this episode. So we only talk about the chain after the microphone and why we use certain things. But if you're wondering where to start, like which gear to actually buy and which microphone to use, this gear guide is for you. So go to the slef-recordingband.com/gear guide. Now, I'm very curious to hear about your vocal chain or your approach to processing vocals in the recording stage, but also like in mixing, Malcolm. Like what are things you always do, if there are any, and what is your general approach?
Yeah, so I think there is always compression for me with a vocal. So I find that vocals are extremely dynamic instruments. Just even how I talk, I think I'm probably a bad example. Actually, I start sentences quite loud and then finish pretty quiet, and a lot of people sing that way as well. And there's all of this loud music behind them in the song, and we have to make it so that a vocal stays up front, in our face, and clear. So compression is kind of my go-to tool for achieving that. The right mic in the right place, in the right room, is going to get you a lot of the vocal sound. So try to achieve that first, of course. But then from there, I'm using compression to take it the rest of the way into a more, I guess, a vocal with less dynamic range that sounds still natural, though, and then seems competitive in the mix. So that's, I guess, where I start the vocal journey, is getting that mic right, and then jumping onto some compression to kind of keep things where I want them. Now, for me, that compression on the way in is like only one of many stages. For like, I don't compress how it's going to be in the end. This is one of the few spots where I don't try to do it entirely on the way in. Are you the same? Like, I've got reasons for that, but I would love to hear your thoughts first.
You mean that I compress in multiple stages and not just this one time when I record? Or
well, I mean, both of us like to commit on the way in with a lot of things, right? But vocals is kind of the one spot where I don't go 100%. I don't try and take it 100%. I try and get it like maybe 25, 30% on the way in, and then the rest is happening in the box for me, and totally intentionally.
For me, like this not going all the way is similar for me. So I like to think that I go all the way, that I don't go all the way, but sometimes I just like the sound of whatever I'm using so much that I compress more than I thought I would, and then I end up not having to use a lot of compression in the mix because I overdid it on the way in. That happens sometimes, but I try to leave room for the mix as well, because some things I just don't know at the recording stage yet, and maybe things can change. And so I try to not go to 100% while on the way in, but sometimes it just happens because I like to distort and compress things a lot.
Right.
All right. So I have a pretty clear path that I think through, sort of. It changes from song to song, obviously, and from project to project, but the thought process is sort of the same. It's a pretty systematic approach for me, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And when I record, after I pick the right mic for the vocalist, I like to use compression and it's similar to what I do in the mix later. It's just that I use a little bit on the way in and a little bit on the mix, but the why behind it is similar. So I usually use a little bit of high-end, top-end emphasis first before I hit the compressor. So the first thing is actually an EQ in my case, a hardware EQ that I have. So I like to add some highs for most vocal mics. Some very bright mics don't need that, but especially if I use a dynamic mic, like an SM7 or something, it needs a little, like it's a pretty dark mic, and it needs a little top end, a little more air and stuff. And I like to do that first because if I add high end before the compressor, it doesn't get as harsh. The compressor hears more of the high frequencies and clamps down on those. If I do it after the compression, I tend to get more sibilance, and it's harder to get rid of that later. So I tend to add top end into the compressor.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a little low cut to get rid of like rumble and like pop the noises and stuff, and a little top end push, usually depending on the mic. And then I hit the compressors. And the compressors, I say compressors because usually I use two. One of those is set pretty fast, sometimes as fast as it goes. Something like an 1176 or a distressor on the fastest setting, which is what I use most often. And that is to control just the loudest peaks, and it does it very quickly and in a pretty transparent way. And I don't take off a lot. I just take off a couple of dBs, just shaving off those peaks very quickly. If I want a lot of color, I push that a little harder, and with an 1176 or a distressor, you can do that, and it actually distorts a bit as well, but you can also do it in a very transparent way. Now, with that out of the way, after that, I have a slower compressor, like an opto, and this is a pretty classic thing to do. Like, people have done that for decades. Like, the 1176 plus an LA2A, for example, is the classic chain. So the second one is usually a slower compressor, something like an opto or a tube compressor or something like that, or a distressor set to opto mode. And that is just a leveling. That is where I use more compression. Like with a distressor, for example, you can compress a lot without it sounding compressed. Like I can compress 8 to 10 dB and it still sounds pretty natural, but it sounds more dense. It adds a little bit of tone, and it gets rid of this amateur sounding thing that you said, like where this over dynamic vocal thing. Like it just puts the vocal to the front. It lets enough of the transients through so that it sounds close and like aggressive. So that is usually what I do. So one very fast compressor, one slow compressor, and then usually I already have enough color after I do that, so there's not a lot of, depending on the genre, I'll add additional distortion, but usually with the distressors and my tube preamp that I like for vocals, or a transformer that I can hit hard, I have enough color at this point usually that I don't need additional saturation or distortion. Right. And then I hit the computer, and what I record then is, as I said, already pretty saturated, pretty compressed. There's this top end emphasis, so it sounds pretty finished. That's why when I tracked things, I didn't use as much processing in the box compared to stuff that people sent me when they record themselves.
Right.
The chain that I use in the mix then is pretty similar. I just use way less if I recorded it. So what I do, the first thing in the chain then is a corrective EQ, something very transparent and boring like the FabFilter Pro Q. That's the first thing. So I use that. I add maybe another low cut if the one that I used during the recording didn't work or didn't do enough. I adjust. I get rid of resonances, could be from the room or the mic. I get rid of like sibilance that's always there and not really dynamic. So I just basically I do a lot of, or not a lot of, I do as many cuts as I need to get rid of stuff that I don't like. I don't boost at this stage. I just get rid of things that I don't like. That's the first thing that I do. Then it's followed by a de-esser usually. Usually a wideband de-esser, so it's set to duck the whole signal whenever there's sibilance, not just the top end. That's the first de-esser that I use, and it's after the correction. Then this is followed by an EQ where I push even more top end, where I get the mid-range right to make it cut through. If I boost a lot of mid-range, the vocal moves closer and like jumps out of the mix. If I take out the mid-range, the vocal goes back a little bit more into the mix. So I have the style there where I can move the vocal back and forth, basically. And one EQ that is awesome for that is the MAG or MAG, whatever you pronounce it, EQ, MAAG.
Yeah,
the blue
with the
one.
airband.
Exactly, but like the airband is not what I use in this case, but the 650 band on this, the 650 hertz band, the mids band, the red one.
Yep.
That is, I don't know why that's so different from using that same frequency on, let's say, the FabFilter. If I just use that one and I push a dB and a half or so, the vocal jumps out of the mix. And if I take out a dB or so, the vocal sinks back into the mix. And it's
very cool.
It's just magic. It's just a dial, a back and forth dial for me, basically.
Yeah. I'll have to try that.
So sorry?
I'll have to try that.
Oh yeah, it's magic, really. If anytime a band wants me to bring out the vocal a little more, or like when they complain it's like not upfront enough or whatever, half a dB of that or a dB of that, and the problem is fixed usually. It's very cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's the EQ. Sometimes a little bit of that air band as well, and like as I said, another top end boost, upper mid range if I need more clarity. And then compression again, same thing as on the way in. That being said, all of what I just say is what I just said. I use very little of that if I tracked it because I tracked it properly.
Further,
If if someone sent a very raw recording with a lot of problems in a problematic room, I do more of those cuts. I have to use more of the de-essing and I have to use more compression. That's not always the same. But again, one fast compressor, one slower compressor. I balance those two against each other. And then in the end, then after the compressors, usually there's another de-esser. And this time I only take off the top end, and only if there's still sibilance that annoys me. Sometimes it's already gone because the compressors take care of that as well after the EQ. But if there is another instance of de-essing, then it's there after the compressors, and it takes off only the top end. Could be a dynamic EQ band, could be a de-esser, something that just ducks the top end.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the chain, there is, if I need more color, there's some saturation or clipping. Could be something like radiator, sound toys, could be the decapitator, could be a simple clipper plugin, anything that gives me the color I want. Sometimes I send it out of the box through some analog gear that does exactly what I want. Sometimes it's already enough color. Like if I have tracked it and I have 4 compressors going at this point, like 2 during tracking and then another pair in the mix, I probably don't use any additional color. But sometimes, like, I like to distort things, so sometimes I do. And then the final plugin after the saturation is a limiter that, if I use it at all, just makes sure there's like the whatever peaks still come through, it controls them a little bit. It's a very boring limiter, L1 type basically, or the BX limiter by Brainworks does that as well. And it's just 1 or 2 dB, just like the ceiling, basically, just some control. And if you push that harder, this can also be cool. It can bring the vocal even more like close and upfront, and it distorts it again a little bit. But I'm very careful with that. It's just for me. I don't know. I like to use that on many tracks actually as the last plugin, just as a final control to get rid of the last couple of dB. And I don't know. I find when I do that on a lot of tracks, it's much easier for me to get a loud but still the natural sounding mix and master.
Yeah.
So if I shave off a couple of dB at the end of every track, my mix bus compressor has a consistent thing to work with to get the groove right, and then I don't have to use a lot of limiting to get it loud. So I just like to do that.
Yeah, that's a great trick.
So it sounded like a lot, but actually what I'm doing is, to sum it up, I control the dynamics on the way in and at the same time add color. I add whatever the mic is missing with the EQ before those compressors. And in the box, I correct whatever flaws the room and the mic have. I again do EQ and compression, usually EQ first. And then I finish it with whatever color I want and a limiter. So that's basically it. There are some situations where special things are needed, like Soothe or any of those like magic automatic correction plugins, whatever you want to call them.
Yep.
I don't use a ton of those. I like to have control over what I do, and I like to keep it simple, especially with a vocal chain. So, there's always a place for those tools, but to me, it's pretty simple. It's saturation, EQ, and compression.
Right on. Yeah, okay. So we got some similarities, I think.
Okay.
Let's dive in. And then I think like whenever we hit a difference point, we can discuss why.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would totally agree in that the vocals I record generally are more committed than the ones I receive from DIY clients, and I think that's perfect. I think that's the way it should be, probably, because a lot of the bands that listen to this podcast, for example, just don't have a room where they're able to hear exactly what's going on, like you or I might have the luxury of, right? So it makes more sense that we are committing further, and we have more gear available to do so as well. So it's totally fine if you're like, hey, I want to be like Benny, but I don't have these tools. It's okay. You can record without committing anything, and you can still get a great result. It's just going to happen later. But the reason I don't usually go 100% to the finish line with my vocal on the way in is because of like an obsession of de-essing. I've ran into a couple situations over the years where like if I didn't get a compressor or a de-esser in front of my first compressor, or before heavy compression happened, there was just no fixing it, despite me owning like 6 different de-essing plugins now.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
I don't.
can I say one thing now, because otherwise I forget, because that is interesting. Do you do that even? Okay, you basically said it. You do that when you record. You still feel that it's better to have a de-esser pretty early before you do too much compression.
Yeah, so I don't have a hardware de-esser, so
Yeah.
I
Okay,
almost always do have a compressor before it hits a de-esser.
Okay.
But then I don't go too far, and then there ends up being a de-esser before like my primary in the box compressor, which is really grunging things up.
Okay, I'm asking because I totally feel you there. I have the same issue, and I love to de-ess. That's why I use 2 de-essers and sometimes an additional dynamic band and sometimes soothe or whatever is necessary. But the thing is, there's one thing that solved it for me when I track it. When I receive things, as I said, the de-esser is right after the correction, or like those two go together. There's a FabFilter EQ and a de-esser before I hit anything, because of exactly that reason. I just don't need that when I track, and that is most of the time, and that is because of the distressor. Because the distressor, if you set it to, if you set the sidechain, if you enable the upper mid-range boost on the sidechain, and you push it harder, it actually gets a little duller. Like it acts as a de-esser and compressor in the same way, and then the saturation that it adds, I don't know, for some reason, that thing is so smooth that I don't feel the need to de-ess my own vocals a lot when I track. That's the reason. Like once I figured that out, it eliminated a lot of the de-essing needs for me. And I wish everyone who sends me like vocals would use a de-esser and do exactly that, a distressor and do exactly that. So there's this.
There you go.
Otherwise, I totally agree.
Go buy a distressor.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. Yeah, so I don't have a distressor, unfortunately. I end up using 1176s most of the time, which don't do that. I find that
the opposite.
They do the opposite. Exactly. So my kind of usual goal is to make it sound like if I received the file that I've recorded, it'd be like, wow, this singer just nailed it. Like they have the perfect dynamic ability to make their vocals sound so full, but in reality, there's a compressor helping them. That's kind of like my motto of what I want to capture on the way into the computer, is a compressor that makes it sound like they sang it perfectly, dynamically. And then I go nuts in the box. So, and now I should clarify that I'll try and get it to what sounds like finished to me in the box while we track it, so that the singer is also monitoring that. That's what I'm hearing. We're hearing like a very processed vocal, I guess, on the way in. It's just not actually being grabbed because I'm going to tweak with de-essers for way too long, probably. Afterwards, and different. It almost always changes for me, funnily enough. What doesn't change, and what you didn't mention and isn't really part of our outline, but I want to bring it up, is that I usually get my vocal effects figured out at this tracking stage as well. So I'll figure out my delays and reverbs, and they'll usually stick to the end of the mix.
Okay, I wanted to add that in the end, basically.
Cool.
But yeah, it's but you have to mention it now because it's interesting that you do it at this point, because I do it for the monitoring as well, but just very rough. Like I don't commit, and it can change a lot. But okay, yeah. To me, in my mind, I view the vocal chain as like the inserts, and there's no, and I don't use, many people do that, but I don't use delays or reverbs and stuff on the inserts. I do that on the sends.
Yes.
And I really, at this point, like doing tracking, it's very, very rough. And yeah, I'll get to that later, because I have a pretty standard approach to those as well. Yeah, but go ahead. It's interesting that you mentioned it right away.
So I agree. It's also rough. Like I end up changing how they sound, but like the timing of them and their presence is like really important for me to like feel like we're in the song. Like if there's meant to be a heavy slapback delay, I need to hear that. I can't imagine it and for later.
Yeah.
And I want the singer to hear it too. So I usually get that stuff going. We listen to it louder than it will be in the end, but that's natural. Yeah. So there's a compressor on the way in, and that's usually it for me. sometimes an EQ, but usually it's a compressor on the way in. And then in the box, I don't track with any de-essers because my favorite one adds latency. So just I skip it for now. But I'll definitely have another compressor go in heavier, usually 1176 style again, or an LA2A gets in there as well. And then let's just now say that was our tracking chain. My mixing chain, it's usually the same as you. There's often a little EQ before the de-esser, but sometimes it's just a de-esser right away. And I like the wideband as well, same as you. And then I'll hit a compressor real hard, and then I'll usually have an EQ after that. And that's where I tend to do like any major lifting is post compression. I don't know why that is. It's just kind of stuck. I just started doing it. And then for me, I usually have a limiter there at that point, and then often I'll have a compressor after my limiter. Just to sometimes because you can kind of limit harder than sounds good, and then bring life back to it with a compressor after the limiter sometimes. This depends on how dynamic the singer is, that order. I feel like it would swap. If the singer had a really good control of their dynamics, I would go put the limiter to the last thing and just have them like you were using it, just to shave off a couple things. Now, curious if you're like this as well, Benny. That's maybe my first, like my individual vocal chain, but now they're all going to be fed to like a master vocal bus where I'm going to have more stuff going on. I'll have like another compressor where they're all being fed to. I'll have possibly a limiter on there as well. And then that's where I jump into my like auto mixing plugins like Soothe or Gullfoss is one that I'm really enjoying on vocals in particular. By the way, Benny, if you have Gullfoss, it's like one of the coolest de-essers ever. Definitely.
I haven't. I don't have it, but I heard that like just a couple of days ago, I think they released it. It's a major update that people are raving about. So
yeah, they got a mastering version of it now, which is cool. Okay. But yeah, so that kind of stuff where I'm now trying to like have it react to all of the vocals at the same time and create a kind of glue amongst them.
Yep. Yeah, I skipped that for now because I didn't want to do like too long my first part, but yeah, same here. So before we get to this, like, because we should talk about that, and there's additional stuff like parallel processing and stuff as well. But I want to explore one or two things a little deeper that you mentioned in your vocal chain on the actual vocal track.
Right. I did skip one, I'm realizing, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah, add that, and then.
Okay. Well, I would say pretty often these days there's some kind of saturation plugin as well. And that I would say there's no consistent place for where that lives. Sometimes it's like the first thing in the chain. Sometimes it's the last thing. It's just depends. You just have to tweak and use different plugins until it sounds right.
Yeah, that's a great segue into what I wanted to ask and say about your chain, because I feel like a lot of it, and you already said it, a lot of it depends on how controlled the dynamics already are, like the performance already is. That determines like everything you do, basically, because I agree. Sometimes you need to add a little bit of color or whatever is lacking in the beginning before you even start the chain. Sometimes it's enough to do a little sweetening at the end. Sometimes you need the limiter before the compressor or before the compressors, just because it's so dynamic that the compressors don't react properly to whatever is coming in. That's part of the reason, by the way, why I do this 1176 LA2A pair thing or distressors or whatever. Because if you set that first quick one to be really, really fast, it's almost like a limiter, and it is basically a limiter. And then what happens is that the slower one that comes after that sees a more consistent level and like can react to the actual dynamics and the groove of the song and the articulation better. And if I don't do that, I feel like that slower compressor is jumping around too much. It's pumping too much, and it's not really musical. So I have to control the peaks first before I hit the musical compressor, so to speak. And that's, I think, similar to what you described with using the limiter first. And I think my limiter is the quick compressor first. Right. And then that limiter in the end is just really the ceiling that barely does anything. It's just, I feel better if it's there, honestly. Sometimes I could just turn it off and there would be a difference, but I just feel better if it's there. Yeah. And then with the saturation or also EQ after the compressors, it's a little sweetening thing. Like I said, I EQ into the compressors, and that's true most of the time, but sometimes I have this finished thing and I still think something is lacking. And then, of course, I just add in the end some sweet EQ, some Pultec or whatever, some
Right.
EQ, or sometimes just a simple fab filter or whatever. If I just think everything's cool, but it's a little dark, I might just add a tiny like shelf or tilt or whatever just to make it a little brighter, or some sweetening with some EQ that I really like. After everything, that can always happen. Same with saturation. Totally depends. But the heavy lifting I usually do before the compressors, and that's also because of that obsession with sibilance and controlling it. And I feel like boosting a bunch of top end, which I often do, for me at least, works better into the compressors than afterwards. If I use an 1176 heavily and then boost top end after that, it's crazy sometimes.
Gets too much.
Yeah, painful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
One thing I did skip over that I've been doing a lot lately is throwing sometimes like widening stuff right on the track.
Interesting.
So micro shift is one that I'll sneak in a little bit, and it's normally running less than like 10%.
Wait. But that would mean your vocal track is stereo.
It does.
Okay.
So what happens is it's not right on the track. It's actually right on the bus.
Okay, yeah.
So I've got my lead vocal and then my doubles going to a vocal bus that they're sharing. And on that bus, I'll sometimes throw it in. And sometimes it's right on the track though. But yeah, it does turn it to stereo, technically. Yeah. But it's run so thin. But it's been something that I've been enjoying. I normally like a little bit of that on like a lead vocal, and then sometimes I do have an aux track, a send set up with a different doubler. It's just been lately I've been using microshift, and this is the quickest way for me to do it.
Yeah, I like that too. I just need to add one thing here just to not confuse people, because it doesn't work the same in every DAW. Like in Cubase, for example, I cannot just use microshift on a mono vocal track. It doesn't turn into stereo. It just stays mono and it doesn't work. Like it's just, it does weird phase thing, but it doesn't get Y, so it does not do what it's supposed to do. So if you want to do that in Cubase, you would have to create a stereo track, move your plugin chain over, copy the audio over, and then insert the microshift there. You can't just do it on a mono track. That's why I just wanted to say that, because if before people go and try and their DAW doesn't do that,
right?
So
I had no idea.
What we're saying, yeah, exactly. So what we're saying is microshift, what it does is an artificial double thing. So it creates a fake double left and right that is those are slightly delayed and pitched up and down. It's a classic doubler effect that has been done for a long time, and that plugin does it really, really well, and it works like a charm. And if you do use it as a send, it's very easy to set up. You use it like a reverb, and you balance it with the dry vocal to the point where you feel it's right. But of course, you can just add it to the track itself on an insert, but that means the track has to be a stereo track, because otherwise you don't get the left and right doubles thing.
Yeah, it definitely has to either convert to stereo or put it on your stereo bus, whatever. Yeah, it's just been fun. I can automate the mix from chorus to verse, stuff like that. It's just been like a nice little creative one, and it sounds pretty great. It's really easy to overdo though, so you have to be careful.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, cool. So let's go. Okay, then let's dive into the effects thing and the routing thing again, because that is also something that could potentially confuse our listeners. So it sounds like you do pretty much the same to like what I do, like when it comes to routing. So in my case, I have if there's multiple lead vocal tracks because they overlap or whatever, I don't put any plugins on those tracks. I just bus them together on one mono track. That's called my lead vocal master usually. And that is just a fader that is the lead vocal track if there's multiple lead vocals. And they all go to this one that's mono, and it has my vocal chain that I described. Then this gets sent to the vocal bus together with my double vocals master fader. So all the doubles go to their own fader as well. All the harmonies go to their own fader, all the backing vocals go to their own fader, all the gang vocals have their own fader, like all these different types of backing vocals.
Little subgroups.
Exactly. And all those subgroups, all those faders go to the vocal bus. That is the group that has all the vocals.
Yeah.
And on this vocal bus, I do basically what you do. Sometimes it's just a simple slow compressor that does the auto mix thing for me. So sometimes it's enough to just have a compressor, and when one vocal is going, the compressor does nothing. But when a lot of vocals are going on, it just the input level increases, and then the compressor starts to work and controls it a little bit, and that just means I don't have to turn down all the vocals every time the backing vocals come in, because the overall vocal level stays consistent, and whenever the additional layers come in, the compressor just controls it a little bit. So that is the most basic function on that bus for me. But as you said, sometimes I like to use things like Soothe or a multiband whatever thing, or I haven't tried Golfus, but I think I have to try it at some point. But that is the point for me, where I use whatever I feel does a great job of controlling and gluing all the layers together in a way.
Yes. Yeah, totally. We wrote exactly the same, I think. Sounds like it. It's pretty well you route to as detailed a bus structure as you can, and that's what I do as well. It's like if it can have a subgroup, it does, and then they all get fed to a master as well. Ironically, I have this stupid thing. This is truly stupid, but I like it, so I keep it. But I've got like that master vocal all bus, and I've got one for all my guitars and all my bass and all my drums. Everything like that has their all bus. But then they all go to another stereo track, which is what I call the stem track. And I can just commit them, and that's kind of why they're there. Is like I can just click commit on them. I could do that to the other ones though. But they're all in their own folder, and I just think of them differently. It's just like this little mindset thing for me, where I look at that folder by itself, and I can kind of imagine if I'm stem mastering, it like changes how I think about doing it. Like, okay, can I fix the problem here, or do I need to go back into the multi-track? It's like a little stem mastering session inside my own session, but it's totally redundant. Totally redundant.
Yeah, but it's the same for me for that reason. I have in Cubase, in the mixer view, you can pin certain channels to the right, and they always stay there if you scroll through the mixer. I don't know if you can do that in Pro Tools as well.
That sounds awesome. No, I can't. I love that though.
Yeah, and what I do is like I have my drum bus, my bass bus, my rhythm bus, my lead bus, and my vocal bus. Those are always pinned to the right, and then the mix bus and the master. So when I scroll through the mixer and do whatever, those always stay there, and I can always look at them. And I need that for the same reason. I just need a way to quickly see the 5 most important groups or stems or whatever you want to call it that are going on. I want to see the levels going into the buses. I want to see my bus compressors. I want to see how all that works together. And I want to switch between thinking about individual tracks and doing the broad strokes and big picture stuff on those buses.
Totally.
So same thing, yeah. Thing.
That's really fascinating.
I also have a mix bus in front of my master bus. That's also redundant, but I like to do that. Like I have a mix bus and I send that into the master. So
same here.
Yeah.
Same here. I even have like all of those individual buses go to an instrument bus, and the vocal skips it, and then they hit the mix bus and then the master bus. There's so many buses. Yeah. It's insane. Yeah. It's totally
also
insane.
What that does is it enables us to quickly export groups like stems when we balance the whole thing, and that's become so important because people need stems for backing tracks, for licensing, for whatever. They need instrumentals. So there needs to be a way to do this quickly. We just hit export, and it creates the final master. It creates an unmixed version. It creates an instrumental of vocal and whatever stems and like all of that as quickly as possible, basically.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. That's great that vocals. You do that too.
yeah, totally. Which is, depending on your computer, there is stuff to think about, because if you do a lot of things, if you send one track into another, if this is sort of a serial processing going on, then it requires your individual cores of your CPU to be faster. If you do a lot of parallel and you have a lot of tracks running next to each other and they all just sum together in the end, it's better for you use your multi-core processing better. So I had to figure that out and find a balance there, because I can run insanely huge sessions on my computer if I don't do a lot of busing.
Right.
But unfortunately, I do it and I like it. And that's why I run out of CPU power sometimes, because the whole chain from start to finish is just so huge, the serial chain, because there's the individual channel, the first master fader, the group, the bus, the other bus, the master, all the things. And that is just heavy on the individual cores, and those are not so fast on my computer, and I cannot use the full processing power of my computer of all the cores properly because of that setup.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah, I have the exact same problem. It's you find a balance, and I think it's worth it even having some CPU errors and stuff like that. It's just like it's laid out in the way that makes perfect sense to me. Just wanted to throw in a term for our listeners if they hadn't heard it before. When we're talking about going to those like master stem buses and working from the big picture at the top there, that's often referred to as top-down mixing, where instead of starting at the individual track and making tweaks there and kind of building them all together, kick, then snare, then toms, or whatever you like to do, you're doing the opposite. You've got all of the drum mics going, and you're just now making EQ moves to the entire drum kit. And then you're like, okay, now the kick needs a little bit more. You go and solo the kick and figure it out from there. So it's like totally flipping it on its head. Instead of building from the small blocks, you've got all the pieces and you're carving stuff out of that all at once.
Yeah. Great advice, and totally true.
There's no right or wrong. The top down or it's just another strategy. So don't
I find that
don't worry about it.
I find that this happens automatically to me. Like in my experience, and most people that I talk to, they say it's the same. You usually start with like worrying about all the details and looking at every single track and optimizing every single thing, like while you're learning, and you go into all the individual channels and put your plugins there, and you build the mix together from zero to the finished mix. And the more experienced you get, and the more work you do, the more projects you have to finish or want to finish, the faster you want to get. And most of it is really experience and like learning what you actually like and don't like. The more people tend to switch to the top-down approach, or to at least do more broad strokes first, or switching between broad strokes and detail work more. I find that this is a natural process. I find that you get quicker with experience. You get quicker at building an initial balance and correcting the worst problems, but then you quickly move to the big picture stuff, to the buses, to the broad strokes. You create an overall vibe. You just move, and then you find that some of the tiny tweaks that you wanted to do are not necessary anymore, or are So I think this comes with experience. So you really don't worry too much about it. Just explore everything you can and just learn. And I'm pretty sure you'll get to the point where you focus more on the buses and groups and that stuff later.
Yeah, I think so. Now, okay, so swinging back to vocals, I think, the reason we're talking about this today is that vocal mixing and vocal recording are just like two of the most highly sought things for people trying to learn this stuff. That is a mystery that people are constantly trying to solve. For good reason, because it's so important. If it's not right, it's obviously wrong. It's a tricky thing to get. So I kind of think we could talk about just like tips for people that are trying to get this right. And I think the most important, like if I had to choose one important thing for helping people get a good vocal, I would say that the most important thing for tracking a good vocal is making sure that the rough mix that you're trying to track a vocal to is pretty good. Like tracking vocals to a terrible reference mix is just gonna sound terrible all the time. Singers can't get into it. You can't really sit your vocal against anything or make any decisions on the compression or EQ at all. I think that is gonna do so much for you. Do you agree with that? What is your big picture advice?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the rough mix, the monitoring, how the person in the room feels is like the most important thing. Totally. I also think that we need to be most careful with vocals because, as you said in the beginning, that we are so used to what a voice sounds like that you can easily overdo it and overprocess it, and we can immediately pick out if something's weird and sounds wrong, even if you don't have the technical terms or the knowledge to put it in those terms. So a listener listening to a song, if it's not an intentional effect that's actually cool, they can usually pretty quickly tell that there's something wrong with the vocal. They can't say what, but they notice it because we are used to what a vocal sounds like. So we have to be careful. Also, I would say the biggest advice for me, the number one advice would probably be, and this goes hand in hand with the monitoring and how the person feels in the room, but it's just always remember that the vocal sells the song and is also like carries all the emotion and energy. It's the one thing that connects with the listener most, or at least for most people in most genres.
Mm-hmm.
And if you remember that, if you keep that in mind, this will inform all your decisions basically, or it should. Like, you should always, whatever you do, whatever, like all those things we mentioned in this episode only serve one purpose. They only have one, there's only one reason why we do that. We want to get the message across. We want to create the emotion that the song needs, or that the artist wants to create. We want to make the listener feel a certain way, and most of that is done through the vocal. So whatever we do here is not just because we like it or because it's some technical necessity, but it's because it does something to the vocal that helps transport the energy and emotion. So if you do one of these things that we said we do in this episode, and you find it doesn't create the energy or emotion that you wanted to create, then just don't do it. Like, there's no reason to do it just because we said it. So if you use a compressor the way we described it, or a limiter, or a saturation, or an EQ, and you find it just doesn't feel right, then do something different. It might be totally wrong for your situation. Just keep in mind whatever the intention was. Keep in mind that the vocal is the most important thing to achieve that, and do whatever does that. Sometimes it takes a little tweaking and learning, and it's a process. And these, what we said, are just starting points. So I would say forget everything and focus on focus on the emotion, and forget rules. Just use it as starting points.
Right. Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah. There's always a compressor in my chain, like we said, but there could totally be a situation where there wasn't. If somehow somebody's saying something so dynamically loud that I didn't need a compressor or a limiter, I wouldn't use one, right? It's just like the job would be done. It would be, honestly, that probably would be hard not to use it. I'd be like, why don't I need it? Because it's so common to need one. But that's a total reality, right? There's definitely been vocals where I haven't added top end to, which typically is something we often do. We like a bright vocal and it sounds shiny and expensive, but sometimes it's just like the mic and the singer, the job's already done. And the song sounds great without adding more. So you do have to trust your ears. With it being such a vocal, like an instrument where, as we've said a few times now, you can just instantly tell if something's wrong. Being honest with yourself and like figuring out what it is, and just like, it's really that simple. You just have to listen to it and be like, okay, this sounds not like a human being because the S's are like 14 dB too loud. It's then, okay, we just have to turn those down. You know, it's like very, if you look at it real logically, it's often pretty easy to actually fix. But you have to be willing to be like, okay, it's not perfect.
Yes, exactly. That's a skill in and of itself. And one of the most difficult ones to learn, I think, is noticing what is wrong and then just being bold enough to do whatever is necessary to correct that. And that can mean a drastic cut or boost. That can mean a subtle thing, whatever is necessary. And also the skill of like realizing when you don't need to do anything. That's probably the hardest of all. Like, as you said, the situation where let's say someone really talented sang the song and a really great engineer tracked it, and you get a vocal that's just perfect the way it is, and it doesn't require you to use compression. Realizing that and being willing to do that is really, really hard, because we tend to default to whatever we do most often and whatever we like. And it might even sound good, but maybe it would even sound better if you didn't touch our compressors at all. And that's very hard to learn, a very hard thing to learn. It probably won't happen in your case, like I'm talking to the listeners right now, very often, because you track yourself. So you need to do something to it. But let's say you have a really, really awesome room and a really amazing vocalist, and the performance is just perfect, and the mic was right, and everything is perfect. You could run into a situation where very little is necessary, or where volume automation moves give you a way better result than a lot of compression. If it's just to control the volume, maybe you don't need compression, you just need a lot of automation to get the volume control you need, but you want to leave the vocal as it is, because that will give you the most clear, natural, and upfront and big sounding vocal. That's something we maybe need to add, that the more you compress something, the smaller it usually actually sounds. So this sounds counterintuitive because people think it's the opposite, but that's actually what happens.
Yep.
An uncompressed vocal that is just automated a lot to stay consistent usually sounds bigger and fuller than a squashed vocal. So
Yep.
you got to find the balance there as well.
Totally, yeah. There's volume automation and clip gain are both your tools in that situation. And that you made me realize I left out probably the one plugin that has been on every vocal chain I've done for years and years that somehow I just didn't think about today. But Wave's Vocal Rider, it's a volume automation plugin they make that kind of auto rides the fader for you. I use that every single time. Like that always lives on my vocal bus or my lead vocals track. I use it all the time. Just so I can't believe I forgot that.
Interesting, because I haven't tried it. I don't know why actually. But does it what it's supposed to do?
No, it doesn't. But what it does is it does something, and it makes it so that it's much less dynamic before it hits my main compressor. That's what I use it for. So it's like it's not doing a perfect job. It doesn't sound like an automated vocal would, but it makes it so that it is closer to an automated vocal when it hits my compressor. It's like it's like the 80-20 of vocal automation for me.
So I guess it's one of those, whenever it is on $29 sale or so, just grab it and
totally.
It's good enough.
I think so, for sure. Yeah. So clip gain and that usually does it. And then at the end, once like my vocal chain is done and like the mix is really close, I start automating chunks from there. So it's like, oh, verse up 5 dB or not 5 dB. That's a big boost. I want my verses up 5 dB.
Yeah. Exactly.
But like normally I can get away with moving chunks of the song rather than individual words at that point.
Yeah. I think that is an episode in and of itself. Like we should do an episode on automation at some point because there's a lot we can talk about there.
Oh, definitely.
But I agree, same. So the one thing that is left now is, and we should do that really quickly, but I want to add it, and that is sends and parallel stuff. And I can do this really quickly in my case. So we talked about the chain, we talked about the routing, we talked about the why behind all of that. We talked about like our most important advice and what you should always keep in mind. Now, Malcolm, you said like some effects are crucial for you while you track. Same for me, but it's really rough for me. It's just I want to get the sense of space. I want to get if the delay is part of the sound, I agree. I want to hear it. But maybe it's the genres that I'm doing most. There's not a lot of effect stuff going on that's super loud most of the time, unless it's for a specific part as an effect. So in my case, what I do is I have a vocal crush bus that I run in parallel, a send and return configuration, like an effect send, that has a very, very aggressive compressor that distorts a lot also. So it's really like, it's really destroying the vocal. And I can blend that in with my lead vocal if I want to, and that really gets it very, very upfront, very aggressive, but also a little sibilant, but sometimes that's cool for screaming and stuff. Like whenever I turn that fader up, it's like someone was screaming right into your ear, and especially in headphones. So I like that for a little extra aggression and density. And then when it comes to effects, I have usually a couple of effects set up that I can choose from for the vocals. And I do the same thing for guitar-specific effects and drum-specific effects, because all those effects go into those groups in the end, like those buses in the end, so that when I export a vocal stem, I want to have it with all the vocal effects. So the same routing applies there. I need to be careful with that. So I don't send all of my effects to the stereo out, but I send it to the vocal bus. And what I have there is I usually have a mono slap delay and a stereo slap delay. The mono slap delay, what it does is it just adds some depth. Like if I turn it up a little bit, it just moves the vocal back a little bit. It makes it blend better with the mix, but it's a very subtle thing usually, unless I want a Johnny Cash, like obvious slap sound or whatever. But usually it's just a tiny bit of like depth and finding the right place in the mix for the vocal. Then I have a stereo slap delay that I use a lot, and I sometimes use that instead of reverb because it's like one. It's a slap delay. So there's the feedback is set to 0. So there's like
just one repeat.
One repeat, on each side, slightly different times. And what it does is when I turn it up, it sounds like a room, sort of.
Mhm.
Like it just creates, it doesn't sound like a slap delay, really. It just creates width and a little depth and makes it blend with the mix better. And it does a similar job to like what a reverb would do for me, but without the long tail that gets in the way or like muddies up the mix. So for most mixes in the genres that I work, a really obvious reverb is not appropriate or is not something I want to hear in those mixes a lot. But I still want to blend the vocal with the instrumental well, and I want to have this width and depth. So instead of using a long reverb, I often just use the stereo slap thing, sometimes in combination with the mono delay. And I just find the right balance where the vocal sits in the mix and has this sense of space, but without the long decay getting
Right.
in the way of everything. So there's that. And then I have a vocal reverb in case I want reverb. I don't go into details there because it's different for every song. It can be a plate, it can be a hall, it can be anything.
Yeah.
But I have a reverb set up in case I want it. And then I have a mono delay and a stereo delay, which is not a slap, but more repeats, basically more repetition.
And
where
probably slower.
Yeah, and that's more a rhythmic thing where I actually want to hear the delay more than just being a subtle thing.
Mm.
Yeah, that's all I can say about that. It depends on the song. It can be eighth notes, quarter notes. It can
Right.
be completely not in sync with the song, because that can be sometimes very cool. Sometimes in sync sounds a little cheesy, and
Right.
sometimes it's better to actually have it not synced with the song. But also that can be used instead of reverb because it doesn't muddy up and clutter the mix as much.
Right.
And then finally, I have things like modulation, things like choruses, or like a chorus or a microshift, as you mentioned. Anything that can be used as a widener or doubler or slight modulation thing when there's no real double, or when I want to have something like a Dave Grohl vocal sound, or these modulation stuff things. So I have those on separate returns as well, and I just send to those effects whatever I feel is appropriate. And that's
Awesome.
basically my setup.
Yeah. Just to touch on the long delays, often we call those delay throws because it's like you're throwing an echo of yourself. I don't know. That's how I picture it. Yeah, very similar
Okay,
thing.
well,
Oh, go ahead. You got something.
No, yeah, just real quick. Interesting, because delay throws, I actually do those differently. I don't use those for them. Like the obvious delay throws that happen like once or twice a song, if at all, like where you have this break or whatever, and just the last word just repeats. I do those differently. Like I have a separate channel for that, and like a separate effect send return configuration for that. And I will copy my lead vocal track, and I will just copy like the one word that I want to repeat, and I copy that over, and I send that track to the delay throw track, because that way I don't have to automate things. I just drag whatever word I want onto that track.
That's awesome.
So I only get the delay of that one word. I don't have to automate stuff. So it's just a duplicate of it's just a duplicate of my lead vocal track with the same settings. It goes to the lead vocal bus and all of that. But it has the send to the delay throw, and I just drag things down.
Killer. Okay, I'm gonna steal that. That's so much. That's speedy. I really dig that.
Yeah.
Nice thinking. Okay, cool. Yeah, similar effects going on here. I love my slapback delays as well. I find them to be very effective, both as transparent things, but also as like heavy sounds that are very obvious. I think they sound great for that stuff too. I usually do have a reverb going. Not always very loud, but I'm usually, like, my vocal room, my booth is so dead that a little bit helps, I think. And I'm a sucker for some reverb on vocals too, but delay is definitely my focus. I got some long ones set up as well. Totally the same. The only difference being that my crush is almost always done just right on the channel, using like a mix knob on the plugin itself. So I don't actually have a whole nother parallel send or anything like that. It's just a plugin doing it. I think other than that, we're pretty much the same.
Awesome. I do most of the time. It's on the channel itself as well for me.
Okay.
Like this vocal crush is just sometimes I add it, most of the time I don't, but I have it there, and it's probably because I like that preset that I use there so much that I just haven't changed it in months or years.
Right.
So yeah, it's the the Klanghelm MJUC compressor?
Yeah, totally. I haven't used it in a while, but it was great. I don't know why I stopped.
It's amazing, and it has a preset that's called lead vocals to the front.
Awesome.
And it's a pretty distorted, very aggressive setting that I can't use on its own, like on the track. I would have to use the big knob, but for some reason I just put that on my Vocal Crush, tweaked it a bit, and that's been it for years for me. And
Killer.
It just in parallel, I don't know what it does, but it does exactly what I want from that bus. So
awesome. I have one last thing I think we should use to end this. And it's kind of vocal mixing, but it's not entirely vocal mixing. But something I've been experimenting with a few times lately, and I think it's working pretty cool, is this plugin called Track Spacer, which you feed a sidechain to, and it kind of ducks the frequencies it's hearing from the sidechain out of whatever you throw the plugin on. So I've got it going to my instrument bus or my guitar bus, kind of depending on what I'm feeling. And I'm sending the vocals to the sidechain, and it's ducking the vocal frequencies out of, if it's on the mix bus or on the instrument bus, it's ducking those frequencies out of the entire instrument bus. Extremely light-handed with this, but it's just carving out like an EQ that matches the EQ of my vocals and creates a little space. And I'm finding that I can actually have my vocal like a dB or two quieter into the song, but it still sounds kind of just as loud because of the room created by Track Spacer. And then that's letting me squeeze out like another dB of loudness on the master. It's kind of been cool. I don't know. It's like extremely light-handed that it's like hard to tell if it's doing what I think it is, but I think it's cool.
I need to experiment with that as well. Man, some of these newer plugins, like all these automatic like Magic plugins that are out there these days, I'm such a control freak that I generally don't trust those things enough to use them a lot. So I'm very careful with those, and I like to do things manually. But some of those are really, really great, and I played around with Track Spacer, and it really impressed me. And I might move some of the things that I do to that plugin eventually. I haven't used it with vocals as much, but I have used it instead of the typical kick bass sidechain thing, or cool. So these things, or I guess I need to play around with those things more, but especially with a vocal, I'm so careful.
Yeah.
So as you said, very light-handed with stuff like that. But
so it's not affecting the vocal EQ, but it's affecting the EQ of everything else, which affects the relationship. I think I would say that it has worked a couple times, not each time, but sometimes you just need it to sit further in the mix but still be heard, and that's been a solution.
Totally see that.
Yeah, and that's kind of the crazy thing about these plugins like Soothe, Spiff, Gullfoss, or Track Spacer is that we can't do them by hand because they're doing too many moves at once, like the speed and multiple cues and notches they're making. Like it's not even possible for us to do it by hand. But we also can't control what we don't want them to do. Sometimes they're doing too much.
and also you're totally right. We can't do it by hand, but also it's not always necessary that you do all of those things. Like
exactly. Yeah.
And that the dangerous thing is whenever you put on Soothe or any of those things, it immediately sounds, or you think it immediately sounds better, or it immediately. You see what it does. It's so fast. It does all those things, and then it gets rid of harsh things or whatever. And you immediately think like, this is better, and I can't possibly do that myself, so I leave it on. But sometimes it's just still not necessary. Sometimes it makes things more boring. It takes the edge off. And sometimes it's great, and that's the dangerous thing with all those tools. But there's a place for all of these, and Track Spacer is one of those where, if used carefully, can really, like, I think it has this and Soothe have, I think, improved the overall quality of some mixes out there these days a lot. Like some of those tools are, I think, responsible for some of the best mixes, or like a quality improvement over the last couple of years that I've heard. Because overall, I don't think that every production now sounds better than it did 10 years ago. But there are some that really stand out and that are amazing that wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And part of, besides that they are, the people making these mixes are responsible for that, but part of it is also the tools that are available now because some stuff just wouldn't have been possible, especially with the very dense, very loud mixes that still sound super clear and dynamic.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago.
Yeah,
We were
those
talking
tools.
about loudness wars and mixes being crushed and all that back then. And these days you get mixes just as loud, but they don't sound crushed anymore. And they sound dense, but still clear. And like this has improved. And that is if you know how to use these tools the right way.
Yeah. Like we keep calling them like auto mixers or something, but in reality, they're like just really quick fixes. And like every time I use Soothe, I have to do something corrective with an EQ after. Like it's like without fail, it's like that fixed the problem, but now I have to go make up for this.
Yeah. So I think for people who know what they're doing, those tools have upped the quality and like improved the quality of mixes in the last couple of years. But at the same time, they are also part of the reason that overall quality of mixes on Spotify, for example, so have decreased because they let more people think that they let more people to think that they can do mixes themselves or use these auto plugins and don't care as much anymore.
Right.
So there's always the downside. If you know what you're doing, if you put in the hours, if you spend the time experimenting, and if you're careful, they are wonderful. But if you think that now you don't need to mix properly anymore, then they are dangerous.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, cool. That was an intense episode. There's so much to talk about when it comes to vocals.
Yeah. I feel like we gave like a crash course on a couple different situations, but we could have kept on going and gone deeper on any of them. But
yeah,
that's a good
so
primer.
I feel like in the future we need to do an episode on routing maybe and on automation. Definitely automation. That would be a fun thing. Great. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, let's wrap it up. And by the way, we have an episode, and it's episode number 11. It's called 5 Essential Steps to a Pro Vocal Recording. I don't know how good we were
at podcasting back then.
At podcasting at back then, exactly, with episode 11. But I assume the content is still right. Like it's still good information in there. So you want to check that out probably. It's episode 11. If you go to the slef-recordingband.com/11, you can check that out. It probably is a great addition to this episode if you haven't already listened to that one.
Totally.
And then, as I said, the gear guide is at the slef-recordingband.com/gear guide. That helps you pick the right microphone to start with.
Awesome. Yeah, check that out. Yeah, I'm trying to think back to what I feel like I've changed so much of my technique and approach to everything music since we started this podcast. It's crazy. So I'm sure the core principles are the same though.
Yeah, I think too. And if not, let us know. Then we should do an update of that episode. Maybe we should do a vocal recording update in, I don't know, late 2021 or 2022.
Totally.
Awesome. Thank you for listening. See you next week.
Take care. Bye.